I think the new atheist movement, I mean, it really stood up tall, roared loudly, and beat its chest in the public square for a while. And now what I see, and it's been happening over the last decade, is it crash and burning, and Christianity is standing untarnished in the rubble. That's really interesting. Some folks won't really understand exactly what I'm talking about there.
I do not understand what you're talking about here.
When you don't really know what the intellectual arguments are, you can kind of straw man beat it to the ground. But when people actually lean in and investigate some of the claims, there are devastating arguments in favor of the existence of God and that Jesus is who he said he is.
That's what I'm here for. Devastating arguments in favor of the existence of God and Jesus. Maybe today's the day I come back to Christianity. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, we're once again following the Golden Boy ambassador to Christian apologetics, finding new giant platforms in which to share his brand of confident proclamation. For instance, he was recently hosted by a former U.S. Army Ranger, John Lovell, on a 1 million-plus subscriber channel called Warrior Poet Society.
Hey guys, my name is John Lovell. I'm a former Army Ranger, war veteran, and now a full-time tactics and firearms instructor. And I wanted to say welcome to the Warrior Poet Society. We're people of deep conviction and carefully tempered minds, and we aim to have hands skilled in violence.
It was an hour-long interview, and the first half went like this.
Guys, welcome to the John Lovell Show. Special guest today. His name is Wes Huff. And if you don't know the name already, you need to, and you're going to, because this guy is super sharp, super bright. He's been on a bunch of big shows, and he is an absolute brain. He can beat you in an argument, but he's also jacked. He could beat you in a fight. Get ready to meet Wes Huff. So first off, you're a scholar. You're an academic. You're an intellectual, real impressive educational pedigree. But at the same time, you're a meat eater, bro. You're an alpha. You're super jacked. Well, can we put a photo of him up on screen? Just looking jacked? Look at Wes Huff looking all jacked. It's like he's going to beat you in an argument, and then he's going to lift you up like Bane, breaking Batman over his knee style. You're working out all the time. You're an academic that doesn't strike me as a Dungeons and Dragons and backgammon in the back room kind of guy. Of like, you're into weaponry and stuff. Of like, I'm looking at you, I'm like, man, you're an alpha, right? You into guns or anything, or weaponry or martial arts? What do you do for workout routine? Tell us about how the academic with the big head also has a big body.
Monday is chest and triceps. Wednesday is typically back and biceps. Then I do shoulders on Thursday and legs on Friday. Sometimes I'll double up legs, one at the beginning of the week. And then they sent me this, which is a replica of a Scottish claymore.
But eventually, we got to something close to the title of the video. Wes Huff debunks top 7 atheist arguments, even though 7 questions were never explicitly enumerated.
For those listening in who struggle with belief in God, it's kind of more in that fairy tale category. They can't get their head around it and may even look down and say, how could anyone believe this stuff? Can you give a quick elevator pitch for why we should believe in God?
Yeah, well, I think we are beings that are instilled with a longing that goes beyond.
Humans have built-in desires for a lot of things that don't correspond to anything outside our psychology. Many long for eternal life, unending wealth, absolute control, infinite knowledge, or to be universally liked. These longings tell us something about human cognition and emotion, not about what actually exists in the external world. Our wishes don't create facts. They create stories.
And I think we should push into some of those things that we often assume. You know, there's miracles that we read about in the Bible of turning water into wine and walking on water and Jesus healing people. But realistically, if the first miracle happened, that everything came from nothing.
This is going to be important later. Everything came from nothing is part of the Christian story. Sometimes Christians get confused, as we're about to see, and think that this is also part of other people's story, but it is not.
Then everything else is kind of small pennies. In that, if we believe in the origin story of secular materialism that everything came from nothing. And
Oh, he didn't even get to the end of the sentence. Secular materialism does not posit that everything came from nothing. We'll get to the details in a minute.
there was no progenitor, right? The Big Bang had no Big Banger. Then that's I think harder to put your faith in.
It might be hard to put your faith in that, but that's not what's posited. When I was a Christian, I relied upon the misrepresentation of my Christian leaders, like Wes, and quippy slogans that encouraged me to not look into it for myself. Now, if you can accurately articulate cosmology and then proceed to discount it, well, that's well and good. But if you can't even describe it, then it doesn't mean much that you don't believe it. That's simply not intellectually honest.
You mentioned the origin of the universe. You have all this matter, Alpha Centauri, Venus, Earth, oceans, rocks, everything. I'm being led to believe by the atheist camp that everything just came from nothing.
No, that's not right.
And they rewind the clock to a Big Bang where it's like this singularity, which is still the same amount of matter. They just packed it real tight.
Okay, so it's probably worth discussing what modern cosmology does or doesn't say. It wasn't long ago that I thought the Earth was 6,000 years old, so I'm not too far ahead of John here. I'm going to rely heavily on a new book called Battle of the Big Bang by astrophysicist Dinesh F. Shorty and science communicator Phil Halper, who runs an excellent YouTube channel called Skydive Phil, which makes phenomenal documentaries featuring the world's best scientific minds. They were on Alex O'Connor's podcast recently, discussing the project, which aims to be a comprehensive exploration of alternative cosmological models. The claim that the Big Bang says the universe popped into existence from nothing misunderstands what scientists actually mean by the Big Bang.
The Big Bang Theory doesn't say the universe came from nothing. It just says it came from a hot, dense state.
There are actually two different definitions of the Big Bang, and the distinction is important.
We talk about two definitions, the hot Big Bang, and that's just the idea that the universe evolved from a very hot, dense state.
The hot, dense state is what scientists agree on.
And the hot, dense state is what everyone agrees on. Much more modest claim that the universe evolved from a hot, dense state and then expanded.
The other definition, the one that leads to confusion, is the Big Bang singularity.
But there's another definition of the Big Bang, which we might call the Big Bang singularity. That says that 14 billion years ago, time stopped ticking. This was the beginning of the universe.
But here's what most people don't know.
And what's interesting is that neither Penrose nor Hawking actually stood by those theorems. They actually think that some of the assumptions in the theorem don't hold in reality. And so maybe we shouldn't trust the idea that the Big Bang was the beginning.
And when physicists were surveyed at a major conference, there was much division, but...
And in fact, the only one where we got a majority view was that the Big Bang should not be considered the beginning of time.
Why don't scientists trust the singularity? Because it represents the breakdown of our current theories, not physical reality.
And what is a singularity? As I said, this is this place where everything goes infinite. It's not really a physical thing. It's just a limit of understanding. It just tells you that there is this point beyond which we cannot push our laws. Our laws break down.
We're talking about not the beginning of the universe, but rather the end of our current theories, and what we need are better theories. So no one believes that the singularity is actually real.
And so...
But what came before that is the open question.
Interesting.
And scientists are actively exploring many different models. Some propose a big bounce.
You kind of have a collapsing or contracting universe that kind of reaches some maximum density and then a stop and it starts expanding. And that's what appears to be the Big Bang for us.
Others explore inflation, a pre-Big Bang phase.
Inflation happens before that hot dense state. So inflation is, if you like, a pre-Big Bang model, even though a lot of textbooks don't seem to think that. Maybe inflation is past eternal as well.
Surely
The authors examined at least 18 different Big Bang models and introduced a handy table in the index to compare them.
And one of the columns in this table is, does this model say the universe has a beginning? And the majority of them say no.
That's right.
In fact, only one said yes. Even models that involve quantum fluctuations don't describe nothing.
And ironically, neither does the Big Bang say the universe came from nothing. It just says it came from a hot, dense state.
The bottom line is this. The idea that science claims the universe came from nothing is based on interpretation scientists themselves have largely abandoned. The Big Bang describes change from a known state, not creation from nothing. What came before remains an open frontier of research.
Anyway, it's really hard for me to even follow the line of thinking or lack thereof.
Your inability to understand scientific explanations has no bearing on whether they are correct, any more than my lack of belief in God has any bearing on whether God exists. But at least I'm trying to accurately consider what Christians actually believe. Your inability to accurately articulate the scientific topics you're dismissing causes me to assume that you're not actively attempting to understand.
Right.
What is that first step? How do we go from nothing to everything? And so there are some attempts at dealing with that. And actually, this is an interesting fact that Joe Rogan himself has been talking about publicly a number of times on his podcast, is that he says that he's interviewed a bunch of people, cosmologists and scientists and philosophers, and nobody's been able to give him a sufficient answer of how we answer that.
Of course, Joe Rogan has had these things explained to him.
There's this intuitive feeling that there was a time before the Big Bang when there wasn't anything. And there was nothingness, and nothingness sat around for a long time, and then it decided to bang, okay?
Right, it could have sat around for an infinite number of years, right?
Yes, but don't think of it that way, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Don't think about nothingness transforming into the Big Bang.
Okay.
Universes are not an expendable resource. You can make, if you can make one universe, you can make an infinite number of universes just as easily.
I don't understand that.
But actually, all we know really was the universe was very hot and very dense at that time. And we have some theories that the universe was in existence before that, and perhaps some sort of circumstantial evidence. And that means that actually the universe could have always been there, eternal. And when I talk to people sometimes, they get some people get upset about that. Some people would rather it had a beginning. And the idea that it might have been around forever is more frightening somehow than the fact that it began.
I'm aware of what you're saying. I can sort of visualize it in some sort of a graphic form, but it's incomprehensible. Like my mind doesn't have the capacity to expand this sense of distance and size to that grasp.
Again, fortunately, the truth is not limited to what Joe Rogan understands.
Which is really the reason that we exist. That's the reason, because the universe began in a particular form. We don't know why that was. So we will probably find out at some point, and it'll be something to do with the laws of nature. But so I'm always careful. I don't want to... Science can sometimes sound arrogant, right? It can sometimes sound like it's the discipline of saying to people, well, you're not right.
Yes, yes.
And it's not the discipline of saying you're not right. It's saying this is what we found out.
Yeah.
So I like to say that it provides a framework within which, if you want to philosophize or you want to do theology or you want to ask these deep questions about why we're here, you have to operate within that framework because it's just an observational framework.
Yes.
So everything we've said is stuff we've discovered. It's not stuff that someone made up.
Joe may not personally feel he's been given the sufficient answer, but at least Joe should be aware by now that his cosmology guests don't claim that something came from nothing.
The problem with YouTube videos is, it's a problem with a lot of things, but one of the things about being unchecked while you're discussing things is you can say things, you can use big words, you can sound articulate and smooth, and you can do it in a very professional looking manner.
Or do it passionately.
Yes, passionately, convincingly, charismatically, and you're unchecked. But if you did that in front of an expert and you showed them that, along the way they go, stop, that's not true. Stop, that's not how it works.
Right.
Let me show you why this is incorrect. Let me show you how you could prove that this is
Let me
incorrect.
show you objective truths
But this is not happening.
that render your argument invalid.
Right. So people who don't have any education, and then they watch one of these YouTube clips, they start actually believing that this stuff makes sense because it's unchecked.
And I would say it's not about whether they've had education. It's about whether the education they had teaches them skepticism of information and teaches them how to inquire. You realize it's just as intellectually lazy to believe everything you see as it is to deny everything you see.
Yes.
Why should someone know automatically that Earth isn't flat? Yet I tell them in the next breath that the entire universe was once as small as a marble. Right? Both of those sound equally preposterous, except one has evidence to back it and the other does not, and very strong scientific, theoretical, and experimental underpinnings. So when you are trained to inquire, you don't either believe everything outright or reject everything outright. You're trained to ask questions. You're trained to probe deeper than the layer of information that comes to you. That's what should be taught in school, and it's not.
You know, and I said on this podcast, a lot of people want to deny the virgin birth, but then uphold the virgin birth of the universe. I think, you know.
Oh, that's devastating. That's pretty
devastating. How exactly? As a single sentence monument to Wes's willing ignorance about basic scientific facts? He's equivocating a biological process with, well, an event that scientists don't propose. That's as devastating as teasing a Christian for believing in Zeus. It's an actual category error, as opposed to the one Wes will complain about later.
Like I said before, why deny one and not the other? If everything can come from nothing,
No, that's not right.
then is it that much of an impossibility for a virgin to be with child? Well, not really, and not considering that there's a lot more going behind that was predicted hundreds of years before that thing actually took place. And so that's where I think there's always going to be individuals who are going to attempt to come up with solutions to, and maybe they're very intelligently sounding, but I want us to actually think about these in a concrete manner and say, okay, you know, everything came from nothing.
No, that's not right. Oh.
Well, there are certain scientists out there who want to start playing around with the word nothing, and you find out, well, they're not actually talking about no thing. They're actually talking about something. And then we're back to the original question.
This was a big mistake of Lawrence Krauss. Like everyone, he was tired of hearing unthoughtful people like Wes asking the question about getting something from nothing. So back in 2012, he wrote a book which he called A Universe from Nothing, where he did roughly what Wes describes. Krauss tried to explain that the philosophical or religious idea of a true nothing is not what modern physics considers nothing. Sadly, I think this book did more harm than good when it comes to clarifying cosmology to non-scientists like Wes, as apologists have often latched on to the title rather than the substance. But notice that this is evidence that Wes is at least tangentially aware that physicists do not speak of something from nothing in this religious sense, and yet he's had no problem for the last 10 minutes pretending that is what they mean.
What happens when they turn the script and say, well, okay, very well, where did God come from?
Well, I think it's a category error because we don't claim that God came from anywhere.
Wow. That must be frustrating for you to have people who want to know how God came from nothing when you don't think God came from nothing. I can't imagine what it's like to be so misrepresented or misunderstood. But tell me again how I think the universe came from nothing.
Right? We claim that God is the author of creation. He's not part of creation itself. And so it's I think incorrect to try to assume that God came from somewhere.
Asserting that God is exempt from needing a cause because he's not part of creation is textbook special pleading, creating a carve-out by definition. That's the standard theistic move. But what you're really saying is that God is your explanatory stopping point, your brute fact. A brute fact is something that you treat as part of reality with no deeper explanation available. My brute fact is the physical realm. It exists, and as far as we can tell, it requires no deeper explanation either. So now we each have a brute fact, yours and mine. The difference is that mine is observed, measurable, and predictive, while yours is merely asserted into the story. If brute facts are allowed, naturalism is on stronger ground, not weaker, because its stopping point is at least anchored in the world we can actually verify.
And I think there's an aspect of the fact that there are certain mysteries that we're not going to figure out.
Wait, I thought that Christianity was the worldview that provided concrete answers.
I don't think that secular materialism and atheism offers any concrete answers. This is where I think the Christian worldview is not just intellectually credible, but it's existentially sufficient.
And that we don't have to settle for we don't know. But now Wes is telling us that in Christianity there are mysteries that we're not going to figure out? That sounds like we don't know. So this isn't about concrete answers after all. If you don't need to know the mystery of why there's a God instead of no God, then it's obviously just as fine for me to not need to know why there's a material universe rather than no material universe. That's fair, right?
You know, how did everything come from nothing?
No, that's not right.
Well, I think the fact that we, you and I, John, are here and we have this however many pounds of gray matter in our brain.
Jared, do you know the human head weighs 8 pounds?
That is somehow able to ask these genuine, authentic questions should make us pause. Now, otherwise, if it's just chemicals fizzing, if it's no more than the soft drink that I pour into a cup and, that's fizzy and so are the chemicals in my brain, then why trust that?
Wes is the king of bad analogies today. Though, to be fair, this fizzing soda one has been floating around apologetics for at least a decade. Carbonation was chosen as the comparison precisely because it looks like a random chemical fizz. But that isn't remotely analogous to a brain, a deeply structured biological information processing system shaped by millions of years of evolution to generate useful, truth-tracking thoughts that consistently help organisms survive. Trust isn't about what something is made of or how simple or complex it is. Trust is about demonstrated reliability. A pregnancy test is just chemicals reacting, but we trust those chemical reactions with life-changing decisions. Same with pH strips, glucose monitors, breathalyzers, and the silicone in a calculator. The material doesn't matter, the track record does. Our brains work on the same principle. We trust them only to the extent that their outputs match reality. If we kept walking into a wall every time we saw a doorway, we'd stop trusting our vision. We constantly double-check ourselves, revise beliefs, and correct errors. There's no blind trust of the brain, just the same kind of grounded, tentative confidence we have in any reliable system.
I'm not a scientist.
No kidding.
I'm a historian by training, but I think that there are these kind of philosophical and scientific questions that merit a good answer. And I don't think that secular materialism and atheism offers any concrete answers.
It's true. Oftentimes, the answer from science is we don't know or we don't know yet. If you're someone like Wes who demands concrete answers, then I don't know is an uncomfortable place to live. I used to be the same way. One of the hardest parts about my journey has been to learn to be comfortable that I don't know is more honest, but less reassuring than just answering every question with God did it. God did it actually provides no helpful insight. It makes no predictions to be verified. It does not advance understanding. It's just a placeholder with the superficial, with the feeling of being concrete.
You just put a whole bunch of different arguments together to build a real quick defense. I thought that was fantastic, by the way. You should do this professionally. What do you think?
Maybe. It's a good idea. I'll write it down.
I have no doubt that Wes will make a good living from defending God to people who already believe in God. But that doesn't mean he does a good job. This is look at the trees argumentation of the most superficial and generic variety, and is frankly quite disappointing from someone with Wes's credentials and reputation. I'd hoped for much better from the vice president of an apologetics association.
You have the argument from morality, which is one of my favorites. Yeah. We argue, and I think this is one that's very profound in our day and age, because our culture, for better or for worse, is very concerned with topics like justice. And in one sense, I want to say, that's great. You should be concerned with justice. Where do you think that comes from?
In a social species like humans, survival pressures pull individuals in two directions at once. We reproduce as individuals, but we survive best in groups. While the mix of cooperation and self-interest varies between individuals, across whole populations and over time, it forms a stable distribution, much like a bell curve. Instinctively, we don't want to be harmed. And through empathy, our evolved capacity for emotional resonance and perspective taking, we recognize that others don't want to be harmed either. When we are harmed, naturally want to be restored or made whole. Empathy, again, allows us to extend that expectation to others when they are harmed. From these simple ingredients, harm aversion, empathy, and reciprocal expectations, our basic sense of fairness and justice emerges. These instincts have deep biological roots, and culture, reflection, and legal systems have built on them. We don't need a supernatural lawgiver to explain why humans care about justice. It just arises naturally from how social creatures survive and thrive together. Ultimately, groups that ignore fairness and justice place themselves at a long-term survival disadvantage. And history shows that such groups tend to weaken or collapse over time.
You know, you're calling something evil. Where do you think the foundation for calling something evil comes from?
The word evil isn't a fundamentally different category. It's just an intensified form of immoral or wrong. Just like delicious is a stronger version of tasty, or gorgeous a stronger version of visually pleasing. Evil is just a stronger version of moral disapproval. So the real foundational question is, what makes something immoral or wrong in the first place? I think this is where Wes needs to define his terms.
That only makes sense if there is a God who's out of time and out of space, where goodness is actually an overflow of his character, not something he lives up to.
If he defines wrong as misaligned with God's character, then the argument is circular. He's building God into the definition he's trying to prove. For most people, when you dig down into what they mean by wrong, it's almost always about harm. If action A causes unnecessary harm, then action A is wrong in some meaningful sense. This often happens so quickly and intuitively in our minds that it feels like a direct perception rather than an evaluation. But once you slow down and think about it, it's clear that a moral judgment is a judgment. We're weighing effects, interests, and consequences, even if subconsciously. Caring about harm, or positively caring about flourishing, is all that's needed to generate what we call evil. And our sensitivity to harm and our capacity for empathy aren't mysterious. They're rooted in our biology as social animals.
Because if there's an evil, there's a good to compare it to.
He's right, only in a very limited linguistic sense. Terms like right or wrong, good or bad, operate on a spectrum, not as all or nothing binary categories. In that ordinary sense, evil is just an intensified form of bad, much like excellent is a stronger form of good. But that doesn't imply a metaphysical good with a capital G. It just reflects how evaluative language works. You can call something evil without committing to an absolute cosmic standard, just as you can call a food terrible without assuming a perfect platonic recipe exists somewhere.
And if there's a good, then there's a law.
Wes can't mean law in the normal legal sense, because in his worldview, God's character was good long before any legal commandments were issued. So he must be using law more like a natural or descriptive law, something observed to be consistently the case. But if that's what he means, he's about to make a major category mistake.
And if there's a law, there's got to be some sort of a lawgiver. What or who is that?
Legal laws do come from lawgivers, but legal laws are prescriptions, rules that tell people what they ought to do in order to avoid legal consequences. A descriptive law, such as God's character is good, is not a prescription. It's simply a claim about the way something is. This is the same sense as scientific laws, or the so-called laws of logic. They merely describe based on observation. So by using the same word in two different senses, first descriptive, then prescriptive, Wes unintentionally commits equivocation fallacy. It makes the argument sound smooth, but the logic doesn't actually follow.
I think the moral argument you brought up, I think that's a really powerful one. Where I've struggled as somebody who's trying to defend the Christian worldview and give an intellectual answer for what I believe in here. My biggest difficulty with the moral argument is the person I'm debating with or having a conversation with really just can't grasp it. Have you experienced that too?
I have definitely experienced that too. A lot of believers don't recognize that when a non-believer raises the problem of evil, they're making an internal critique. The point isn't my worldview has better morality than yours. It's making the observation that if a loving God exists, as described by the apologists, the world we observe seems inconsistent with that description. Demanding that the non-believer first justify an objective moral standard misses the critique entirely, because they aren't claiming moral objectivity in that moment. Long-term viewers of the channel will know that I don't personally find the problem of evil decisive one way or the other. But I've at least taken the time to understand how the argument works from inside the Christian framework. On a more personal note, when I've tried to have moral conversations with presuppositionalist Christians, things often become unproductive because they won't define their terms. They rely on the ambiguity of everyday moral language and then shift between meanings to create intuitive traps. That's exactly why I no longer discuss morality with anyone unless we first agree on what the terms actually mean. Morality is one of those topics where everyone has a personal sense of it, but relatively few have reflected deeply on what lies underneath. I won't speculate publicly about how deeply Wes and John have examined their own assumptions, but clarity always begins by defining our terms.
Yeah, and for the moral argument in particular, to address your question a little bit more specifically, a friend of mine, Andy Bannister, who's out in the UK, heading an organization called SOLAS, he was speaking when he still lived in Canada at one of the universities here in Canada. And in a Q&A after his talk, someone came up and they made this statement about Christianity being bad for the rights of women.
Oh, great. We're heading into an anecdote about someone supposedly getting owned in a Q&A. This is one of my least favorite teaching methods, because the fact that an interlocutor is underprepared tells us nothing about the strength of either position. It demonstrates only who was more practiced at that moment, not who had the better argument. Stories like this are for entertainment purposes only.
This person came up and brought up this objection about the rights of women. And, Andy could have addressed that specifically. But one of the things that he did, which I think was kind of clever in the moment, is he said, well, why is it wrong to oppress women? No. And the guy said, well, what do you mean, why is it wrong to oppress women? And he said, why is it wrong? I have a framework to talk about why it's wrong to oppress women, but according to your worldview, why should women have rights?
As always, the question, why is it wrong, can be answered only after we agree on what wrong actually means. If we define wrong in the ordinary sense, a label for actions that cause unjustified harm to sentient beings, then the answer becomes straightforward. Oppression means keeping someone in hardship or subservience through the misuse of authority. That is a clear form of harm. And if wrong is at least partially about harm, then oppressing women is wrong by definition. So the issue isn't about needing a supernatural foundation, it's about clarifying the terms. Once we define wrong in a way that reflects how humans actually use the word, the moral judgment flows naturally.
And the guy kept going, well, because it's bad, because it's wrong, and Andy at a certain point stopped him and he said, we're standing in one of the top universities in Canada, and all you can come up with is it's wrong because it's wrong.
Yeah.
That's not overly comprehensive or academic, is it? Mm-hmm. And the guy just went in circles until at a certain point he just said, I don't know why it's wrong.
I'm sorry that the person Andy confronted wasn't prepared for a spontaneous moral philosophy discussion, but that tells us very little about the topic itself. Not everyone at a university, no matter how prestigious, can articulate a comprehensive ethical theory on the spot. Expertise is domain-specific. A Bible scholar or a chemist or an engineer might all struggle equally if ambushed with a question outside their field. And drawing broad conclusions about an entire worldview from one unprepared student is no more reasonable than dismissing the value of the whole university because a random student can't explain quantum physics when cornered between classes.
At that point, Andy said, you can posit that you don't like that women aren't treated well, or that you want women to have rights, but going from an is to an ought merits an objectivity.
Oughts don't require objectivity, they require an objective. An ought makes sense only relative to a chosen goal. Most goals are subjectively adopted, either consciously or by biological or cultural pressures. But once two or more people share the same goal, then they can coherently talk about what ought to be done to reach it. If you want to run a race, you ought to run fast. If you want to get from New York to London, you ought to take a plane. If you want to maintain a healthy body, you ought to be intentional about your nutrition. There is no ought without a subject who wants something. Even the goal of aligning his one life with the character of God is still a subjectively chosen objective.
Yeah. So how do we get there? So I think asking these questions when people bring these things up, I think go a long way in helping them even come to the conclusion. Rather than talking at them, we can dialogue with them and say, I can tell you why, women should have equality because they're created in the image of God just as I am. Yeah. And so they are entitled to rights.
I think my justification is better. because thousands of years of Christians have not interpreted God's word as granting women equality. There's a lot of mixed messages in the Bible.
That's good. So there is a God. Jesus truly did exist. I know I want to be respectful of your time, so we're wrapping up here. But how do we get to, and Jesus did rise from the dead. Jesus really was God among us. Jesus really did die for sins and is a way of salvation. What is a quick-ish elevator defense for, we know Jesus is who he claimed to be?
Yeah, well, I think, there are a few things going on there. I think part of there's a historical case in terms of the reliability of the Gospels that I can think actually can be validated. I think that the Gospel authors communicate that they're actually talking about real history, and they get the small details right time and time again, to the point where I don't think it's an exaggeration to then claim that they get the big details right.
While I strongly disagree with the idea that the Gospels consistently get the details right, let's grant that for the sake of discussion. Historians don't divide sources into reliable and unreliable buckets. They evaluate each claim on its own merits. A text can be very good with ordinary details and still include extraordinary elements that we have no independent way to verify. We see this all across ancient literature. Tacitus is one of the most trusted Roman historians, and we can check him on troop movements, political appointments, and geography. Yet right beside those accurate features, he also reports prodigies, like a cow giving birth to a mule, or ghostly apparitions influencing political events. Modern historians simply treat the mundane and the miraculous differently. Herodotus is similar. His descriptions of Egyptian geography or Persian genealogy can line up well with external evidence. Yet in the same work, we find stories of sacred snakes guarding treasure, fulfilled oracles, and flying serpents in Arabia. The accurate pieces don't automatically validate the miraculous ones. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes real cities, kings, and customs, alongside encounters with gods and monsters. The Homeric epics match Bronze Age weaponry, alliances, and geography, while also describing divine interventions and mythical creatures. Later biographies of the Buddha combine real historical settings and political figures with miraculous birth stories and cosmic signs. Early Islamic historical traditions describe recognizable battles, tribes, and places next to angelic interventions and other supernatural events. The Book of Mormon weaves named cities, genealogies, and everyday life, together with visions, angels, and miraculous events. These literary styles weren't necessarily deception. It was normal in the ancient world. Authors grounded stories in familiar places and realistic details to signal that they were speaking about real people and settings. That technique is called verisimilitude, giving a narrative the appearance of being true. Verisimilitude can make a story feel rooted in history, but it doesn't, by itself, establish that its most extraordinary claims actually occurred. For those, historians still look for independent corroboration, multiple early sources, and explanations that align with what we know about how human beings record and transmit events.
Especially because the people who are the origin points of these stories are the people who, at Jesus' death, thought that he was dead and gone and that the movement was over.
The gospel certainly presents the story that way, but from a historical perspective, we have to be careful. We simply don't know how many of the stories about Jesus go back to his closest companions, and how many emerged through the normal process of storytelling, interpretation, and legendary growth within early Christian communities. Most scholars agree that many of Jesus' followers initially believed the movement was over after his death. That part rings true. What we don't have good data for is how many of these followers actually came to believe he was alive again.
There's a theologian and author named Fleming Rutledge, and she has this great line that says, if Jesus had not been raised from the dead, we would never have heard of him.
A more precise way to put it is that if Jesus hadn't been believed to have been raised from the dead, we almost certainly wouldn't have heard of him. What changed history wasn't the event itself, whatever that event may have been, but rather the conviction that it had occurred. From a historian's perspective, movements spread because people come to believe something and then pass that belief on. Once the second generation held a resurrection conviction, the movement's growth no longer depended on the accuracy of the original claim. The mechanism of transmission is the same either way. So Jesus became known to history not because a resurrection was historically verified, but because early followers were persuaded it was true and organized their lives around proclaiming it.
And on that basis, I think that is a good argument. You know, what's an argument for the resurrection? The fact that you and I are still talking about it 2,000 years later.
Yeah, and the year is 2025 in every country around the world. Why?
As for the calendar, it would be more precise to say that the world uses a system inherited from Christianized Europe, not that the numbering of the year validates the resurrection. Our calendar also uses the name of Roman gods for days and months. Mars for March, Janus for January, Thor for Thursday, but no one treats that as evidence that those deities literally existed. Calendar systems survive because they become embedded in trade, politics, and just our habits. Once Europe standardized on the Anno Domini system, its use spread along with colonial expansion, not because the dating system had been historically confirmed. So the enduring prominence of Jesus doesn't tell us whether the resurrection occurred. It tells us that early Christians were convinced it had, and that conviction shaped cultures, laws, and institutions that eventually influenced global timekeeping. Historical impact and historical verification are two very different things.
And I think, you know, that there are a few instances, I'll just mention very briefly, that we can read about in the Bible itself on Pentecost, right? Acts chapter 2. You go from Jesus' death to the disciples who claim they've seen the risen Jesus, and after Jesus' crucifixion, they go back to the city he was crucified in, and then they proclaim that he was risen from the dead.
There's solid historical evidence that the early Jesus movement began in Jerusalem, but Acts itself is not the strongest place to start if someone is trying to persuade a skeptic. Unlike the Gospels, where we can at least compare different sources to see where traditions agree, Acts is a single source narrative written decades later by an author with clear theological aims. Pentecost, as described in Acts chapter 2, is...
Now, why would you go back to ground zero, especially if you were trying to be dishonest, to the place where people, multiple people, groups of people would have seen him crucified? You know how you could falsify that? A group of people could say, hey, you guys are lunatics.
For all we know, there were dozens or hundreds of people telling early believers that they were lunatics. As we all know, fact-checking rarely stops people from saying false things. If fact-checking worked, then either myself or Wes would be out of a job.
Let's go to his grave, right? It's a Jewish tomb. You can just unroll the stone door.
This is assuming that the gospel stories of Jesus being buried in a known location were accurate. I have several lengthy videos on this topic alone, but to briefly summarize, one should think first about the fates of the bodies of the thieves said to have been crucified beside Jesus. If the Romans were in charge of the bodies, they would have been left on the crosses, and whatever the animals didn't eat would have been later chucked into an unmarked mass grave. If their families had enough influence and access to take charge of the bodies, they would likely end up in a known location. But rich people were rarely crucified, so it was unlikely to be a stone-cut tomb. That said, Jesus' family was from out of town, so they wouldn't bury him in Jerusalem, and the Bible is pretty insistent that Mary didn't get the body. If the Romans and the family did nothing, then it fell to the Sanhedrin, who were obligated to put such people in one of the criminals' graveyards, where veneration was expressly forbidden. These were the only three regular scenarios on the table. Having a rich religious leader from the order who earlier that day voted unanimously to execute Jesus suddenly comes swoop in on a holy holiday and intervene so that Jesus could plausibly end up where someone might remember him is a highly unusual scenario. It is the least likely thing to happen. So it is quite reasonable for a skeptic to favor the more likely scenarios over the least likely scenario, particularly in light of the very embellished Joseph of Arimathea legends in and out of the Gospels.
Now, in one sense, it's not our jobs to convince intellectually everyone that we have a conversation with, right?
That's good, because this video has been highly unconvincing from an intellectual perspective. Wes is much better when he's talking about manuscripts.
You and I's application to join the Trinity, John, has been denied. We failed the minimum requirement. The Spirit is the one who's actually going to make that person and open their eyes in terms of getting to the spiritual knowledge, right?
In that case, it seems apologists should really just give up and spend their time praying for the Holy Spirit to intervene with people. Except that apologetics isn't actually about convincing new people. It's primarily a retention strategy to keep current Christians from leaving.
Christianity and salvation isn't an intellectual assent.
Perhaps not, but intellectual assent to the existence of God is a prerequisite to Christianity. If I'm not convinced that God exists, I can't actually make a choice about Jesus, can I? This is why divine hiddenness is so devastating to non-resistant non-believers like me. God could choose to remove barriers to intellectual assent without denying my free will, and at least let me make an informed choice. But he doesn't.
And so I think there's an aspect of, we need to speak into people's lives and we need to help them understand that this is the reality of it. But it's not necessarily our job to take that person's heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh.
My flesh heart is a muscle that pumps blood. It makes no decisions. Are you trying to say that accepting the concept of Christianity is emotional and not intellectual?
And there are going to be some conversations that we encounter where we're just going to have to walk away. One of the things that I do occasionally is I say, let's just back up from this conversation. If Christianity were true, would you believe it?
Well, if I became convinced that Christianity was true, by definition, I would believe it. That's the way being convinced works.
It's a good point. You could have just saved you and them a couple hours.
If you wanted to save time, we could have saved 30 minutes of talking about leg day and swords. Even better would have been to have had more sophisticated thoughts about the argument for and against God.
Because there's no amount of evidence that would have convinced them. They don't want to believe, and therefore they won't believe. They're going to make sure they're only picking and choosing the evidences they like. So no matter what evidence you give, they'll at the end of it declare, but there's no evidence for God, because they're invalidating perfectly good evidence in favor of what their judgment was before you began, right?
Of course, the reverse is true. If a person isn't willing to entertain arguments against God, then they are equally intellectually dishonest. It's an important warning for all of us to avoid letting our presuppositions blind us from truth.
Wes, such a privilege to be able to get to talk to you. I really look forward to seeing you at the Greater Homeschool Conventions and that 1613 conference. It's going to be good to see you face-to-face, shake your hand and say, thanks all that you're doing. I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan.
I guess the alphas are done destroying however many atheist arguments that was. But if you'd like to see more of this former Christian taking a look at the claims of Christians, please tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there.
Awesome. Warrior Poets, thanks so much for tuning in. See you next time.
Until next time. Later.